So welcome everybody to our second UNESCO Chair Fellow lecture of this year. As you may know, at Eurac Research, we have a double fellowship program in the meantime, which consists of global fellows and UNESCO Chair Fellows. We appoint usually 2 UNESCO Chair Fellows per year. And today is the turn of Alex Putzer. It's the second UNESCO Chair Fellow lecture after the one that Sanya Bakun gave, our other UNESCO Chair Fellow, a couple of days ago. Alex Putzer is a very interesting young scholar. He is currently writing his dissertation on the rights of nature in cities at St. Anna School of Advanced Studies in Italy, with affiliations at the MIT, UPenn, and the New School of Social Research in the United States. He has taught at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, Austria, as a United Nations Harmony with Nature expert and member of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature Academic Hub. Alex employs multiple strategies to develop his field, and as UNESCO Chair Fellow in Interdisciplinary Anticipation and Global Local Transformation, he explores how novel rights regimes influence urban policymaking. May I add that Alex is a very prolific writer too, and that we are all looking forward, Alex, to the quite experimental topic, rights of nature, that you will be introducing in a few moments. Alex, please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Roland, for the nice introduction. So the idea is that I will give an introduction to the rights of nature, to the theory and activism for the next 20-ish minutes. And after that, there should be plenty of time for Q&A. So you should see an image right now. Don't say anything if it works. I think it should work. So rights of nature. I don't know if any one of you knows anything about the rights of nature, but maybe you've heard that there was a river somewhere that has rights, that there is a mountain somewhere else, an ecosystem. And then sometimes the question came, so what does that mean if a river has rights? Can the river now sue other people? Can the river now go to court? And that's what this AI-generated image should show. It's a river in courtroom. And no, that's not what the rights of nature are about. The rights of nature are about a few other things. And that's what I want to talk to you about, specifically about 3 parts. First one is where to find the rights of nature. So it's not only a theoretical idea, but it has also been legally implemented across the world. Second is the reasoning behind the adoption of the rights of nature. So why should we give rights to nature? Why should we recognize rights of nature? And the third one is more of a practical idea, an activist guide, a very rudimentary, a very basic one, how to do the rights of nature. So let's start with a definition. The rights of nature promote a non-anthropocentric understanding of nature. Rather than an object, it is conceived as a subject with intrinsic value, independent of human interests. Now, what does that mean? The rights of nature promote a new understanding of nature. It's non-anthropocentric, so non-human-centric. The human is not at the center of ethical consideration. That means that a river, for instance, is not an object, so an object that can be used, that has instrumental value because you can fish there, you can use it as a mean of transport, you can generate electricity, but you recognize it as a subject with intrinsic value. So the river has a right to exist, to flow for its own sake, and not because it's useful for humans. So that's the very basic idea of the rights of nature, and it has been implemented, where to find them, all over the world. Now, this is a map that, depending on how big your screen is, it might be a little small, but the important things you can see, this is a global estimate, a global map of rights of nature initiatives. Now, the darker the countries that you see there, the darker blue they are, the more initiatives they have. So the United States stick out, Colombia, Ecuador, Australia, New Zealand, and every single dot within the country represents one initiative. Now you're looking at over 400 initiatives in over 40 countries on all continents. 80% of them are in the two Americas, and the United States have about close to a fourth of all initiatives. Now the different colors of the points show the different legal types. So orange, reddish is a court decision. Now this blue, greenish is a local regulation. We have policies, we have national laws, we have also constitutional laws, and different countries and different cultures, different contexts have implemented the rights of nature in different ways. So Ecuador and Colombia here have court decisions, as well as India, and the United States go a lot with local regulations. Now Europe is blue, it's not gray, but it's a growing movement there. So far, it has been more outside of Europe, but it's also a growing movement within. And the growth, you can also see in the two charts at the bottom, that it's really over the past 15 years, it's been, some call it an explosion, but there's definitely a steady growth of these initiatives. Now in Ecuador, that was the one with all the orange little dots here. In Ecuador, that's the only country in the world that have the rights of nature written in their constitution. And to give you an example to see how such a rights of nature law really looks like, it's in chapter 7 of the constitution, articles 71 to 74. And this is the beginning. It states nature, or Pachamama. Pachamama is it's an indigenous concept of nature. It translates roughly to Mother Earth, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. So there's a strong focus on life. There's a strong focus on a dynamic idea of nature, on structures, on processes, can be reproducing itself, it happens, it exists. Now, the second thing that I want you to look at is that all persons, communities, peoples, and nations can call upon public authorities to enforce the rights of nature. So here it says that not only citizens of Ecuador, but everyone else, every human on Earth can go to Ecuador and speak on behalf of Ecuadorian nature. So this idea is really a universal idea of rights. And in fact, some authors argue that it has been formed by taking inspiration at the universal human rights paradigm. So really, this is a universal idea of the rights of nature. Okay. Now, you see that that there are some legal implementations, and it's a bit difficult to talk about the rights of nature because there are many different rights of natures. In fact, the theoretical elaboration, the theoretical ideas and reflections, they started in the 1970s, so around 30 years before they were adopted. And there were different reasonings. I used, for instance, the words, you can give rights to nature or you can recognize them. And that's already a bit of a difference, because if you recognize them, they were there before and we have just not understood them rightly. If we give rights, they haven't been there. We give it to nature. Now, one major reason why we should do that is to counter an idea of, and I said it before, this anthropocentric idea, this idea that the human is unique. Humans are unique. You see it written there. And I want you all to maybe take a second and think if you agree with this statement or if you disagree with this statement. And in fact, 50 years ago, and based on the scientific findings of 50 years ago, pretty much all experts might have been agreeing in the West, at least, and say that, you know, consciousness, we have a mind, we have a soul, we have a we are sentient, and humans are unique in a lot of those aspects. We're the only ones who can use language. We're the only ones who can plan in the future, have a concept of death. Now, in the past, roughly 50 years, a lot of things have changed. And in fact, a lot of those characteristics, a lot of those properties, a lot of those traits are not unique. In fact, and this is a huge chart, so don't be intimidated. It takes a while, but this is an animal welfare comparison chart. So it looks at about 100 of those characteristics that were at one point thought to be exclusively human. And then with scientific advancements, with new findings, they were found to not be exclusively human. So here, this is a list of 11 animals that you see on the top. I don't know if you can see my mouse, ranging from pigs to chicken, carp, salmon, all the way to the silkworm. And the dark blue means that a trait that was thought to be exclusively human has also been detected in those animals. So on the left chart, the very first number is communication. Do pigs talk to each other? Yes. Do chicken talk to each other? Yes. Do carps talk to each other? Yes. And so there's this huge list of those proxies, cognitive and hedonic proxies. And there's a lot of blue, which means that a lot of those non-human animals have a lot of those traits. There's a little red, which is basically no, we could not identify a certain trait. But more than anything, a lot of it is gray. And the gray is we don't know. And so as much as we would like to think that we as humans, that we know so much about nature, there is so much more that we don't know. And all of those little gray boxes show exactly that. In that sense, we don't know if a pig has, for instance, which one should I take? Pigs have a lot of things, but the silkworm, if that has the mirror mark recognition, and in that sense, might be better to be cautionary, to be precautionary. One of the most famous examples of these conditions is sentience, so the ability to feel pain. And again, 50 years ago, it was, or maybe a bit longer, it was thought that only humans could feel pain. Then it was non-human apes, then it was all mammals. And now the discussion is if insects can feel pain. And some early findings suggest that yes. And so we are all basically coming from the same evolutionary process. And it would be weirder if those traits were exclusively humans. So if we go back to this thesis, humans are unique. Okay, we can say humans are unique in their collection of different traits, that much intelligence, with that much consciousness, with that much awareness and language, sure. But the same can be said for any other animal. And so humans are unique, but not uniquely unique. And that's a thing that even Charles Darwin, 150 years ago, when he wrote on the Origin of Species, this book on evolution, where he wrote that the difference between human and non-human animals is a difference of degree and not a difference of kind. So there is an intensity of consciousness that a lot of animals have, but it's not a different kind. And that is the reasoning for, one of the main reasonings for the rights of nature, to say, okay, if the human is not fundamentally different from non-human nature, why should only the human have rights? Because originally it was the human that had rights. And that brings me to this circle of ethical consideration. Originally, only white male Christian landowners had rights. And at one point, this so-called circle of ethical consideration grew larger and included also non-males, non-whites. So women, people of color, and children were included. And then they said, okay, why should we stop at the species boundary? Let's include also non-human animals. And so this circle of entities and natural processes that have intrinsic value continuously grows. And so from human rights, it goes to animal rights, it goes to the rights of rivers, of mountains, and of entire ecosystems. So now I talked about where rights of nature were, talked about why we should apply the rights of nature. And now, excuse me, as a final point, I want to talk to how to do the rights of nature, because there are also many different ways on how you could implement this idea. Mentioned before New Zealand, this could be considered arguably the most successful rights of nature initiative. And in parentheses, it might also be said that success is to be seen a bit relative. It's still a very early movement. So, for instance, the Ganges and the Yamuna River in India, they were granted rights the same week as this river. I'll get to that in a second. But the Supreme Court of India overturned the ruling about 6 months later. Now, that overturning, nobody really heard of that within the field, or not a lot of people, but it's, you know, it's still mentioned that that the Ganges has rights, and a lot of follow-up initiatives all across the world mentioned this case. So in that sense, raising awareness or the symbolic value was almost as important as the legal implementation. Here, the Wanganui is you could say, actual success story, because it really helped the Wanganui. The Wanganui is the third largest river of New Zealand, in the North Island, flowing towards the north. And it is the historical home of the Wanganui ivy, which is the local indigenous Maori population. Now, when the European settlers came 140 years ago, they stole the land, they expropriated the land through a treaty, and that's called the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, the idea was that the Maori signed this and were okay with it, but there was a lot of problems surrounding that signature. And so for the past 30 years, the local government, also called the Crown, negotiated with the Maori to be good again, to have a historical reconciliation process. That was the official word. So basically to right the wrongs of the past. Now, the Maori claimed that the Wanganui, in their philosophy, is an ancestor, one of their ancestors, and it's got to be recognized as such in the law. Now, the Crown couldn't really do that until the moment where the rights of nature, the idea of legal personhood for nature, came into being. And so since 2017, the Wanganui is a legal person with rights. It owns itself, and it became basically the culmination of this struggle between the Crown and the local Maori. So here we can see that an adaptation to the local context, to the historical, legal, cultural context, is very key to make the rights of nature a success. Now, I intentionally chose a place that is basically on the other side of the world. So maybe an example that is closer to Italy, to South Tyrol, might also be illustrative. This is the Mar Menor, that is to the right of this land bridge. It's a saltwater lagoon in southwestern Spain, near Murcia. And to the left, we have the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this saltwater lagoon is huge. It's a huge tourist spot also. And in the mountains that you see in the back, there are a lot of agricultural fields that have agricultural products that use a lot of pesticides. And the runoff of these pesticides flew into the Mar Menor and caused a lot of growth of algae that caused 2 complete ecosystem collapses in 2019 and in 2021. And that was basically a wake-up call. So people knew about the problems with the Mar Menor before, but in 2022, the national government of Spain actually recognized the Mar Menor as a legal person. And it is the first case of rights of nature in Europe, the first legal and legally implemented and legally viable case in Europe. Now, the success of that is yet to be seen because it just took place last year. But what did happen, and I talked to the lawyer that initiated this, that a few farmers that were living around, they heard of this news, of this crazy idea of giving rights to the lagoon. And so they started to look a bit into the issue and found out that the problem were a bit they themselves, you know, the way they handled agriculture. And on their own, they changed, some of them changed their irrigation, their use of pesticides, and became organic farmers. So there is actually already a tangible effect, a seeable effect of this law even without suing anyone, it was a change of mindset, a change of awareness. And we should not underestimate also this symbolic function of the rights of nature. And in fact, in 2021, there was a survey across the European Union that asked if people were in favor or against legal rights for ecosystems, and about 2/3 in the EU said yes. Italy is on the 3rd spot with 3 out of 4 people saying yes, and the least no's. So only 60%, 6 is a lot. Only 6% were against it. So in that sense, prospects are important, prospects are looking fine, but it's important to really know what you want, to really know which rights, which legal concept you want. It's important to know which nature you want to protect, because the nature of New Zealand is different from the one in the United States, is different from the one in Latin America, is different from the one in Europe. And so what I've been doing for the past couple of years is to raise awareness of this issue by giving talks, by talking about different outlets, being also a consultant to different initiatives in Costa Rica and in other places. It's important, and this is an example specifically for South Tyrol, to use these existing structures as was done in New Zealand. So there are national laws, existing environmental protection laws that can be used. In Austria, there is this idea of the Umweltanwaltschaft, so an environmental lawyer in a sense, and every region has one of those, and this could be the voice on behalf of nature. So instead of Ecuador, where every person can speak on behalf of nature, it could be like New Zealand, where there are specific appointees that are experts in the field, that know the whole context, and you can talk to them and they can speak on behalf of nature. So there are a lot of different ways to implement them. And so to conclude, to also give enough time and to stay within the 20-minute bracket, that the rights of nature are there. They are a growing movement. They are increasingly being considered. You could be a bit cynical and say, okay, we've tried all normal reasonings, the human right to a healthy environment. We tried other ways of environmental protection, and they didn't work. So now we also go for the crazy ideas. But, you know, be my guest, they have a lot of potential. Now, a second point is that, and this is, I cannot speak for all rights of nature authors, but for me, the rights of nature is a question about justice and about decision-making processes. Because one argument against them could be, you could imagine that, okay, we only want the river to be clean. So we don't need to give the river rights or recognize the rights of a river. We just need to clean it. So there is no need for rights. Okay, but then you just look at the goal. And for me, the rights of nature is as much about how to reach that goal than the goal itself. And so the question is, okay, we really wanna consider all stakeholders and we want to listen to all voices before we reach a goal. Now, the rights of nature are not a silver bullet. They're not the solution to all environmental problems. So you can just throw the rights of nature at something and it's healthy. That's not going to work, unfortunately, because it needs to adapt to the local context, to the historical, to the cultural, to the linguistic, you know, the use of the word rights or of person. You can also use equivalence to that. And the very last point here was taken by an indigenous leader at a negotiation table at the United Nations. And they said something along the lines of, if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the menu. And so the rights of nature put nature at the table and not on the menu. And with this, I hope I gave you enough input, and thank you for your attention. And if you want to ask me something now, obviously, if you want to ask me something later, here is my email. I think you should also be able to find me online. And the map that I showed at the very beginning is also here, the link. I can put it in the chat, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Alex. That was a quite impressive presentation in the shortest possible way. And Alex is now ready to take your questions, obviously. Take your time, formulate your thoughts. You can also criticize the approach, obviously, as always. May I start, Alex, with just one observation. So first of all, I would say the numbers of people who appreciate and give their consent to this quite experimental idea, which could change many things, are quite impressive. I'm not so sure, though, Alex, if the only 6% of Italians who refuse or are skeptical against the idea really all know, and especially those who consent the idea, all know what they are going to. Because if, for example, I spoke with a colleague, I cannot anymore mow my own lawn, because if I do so, you come by, just you drop by and say, no, I'm against it because this is too beautiful, or there is any other reason, there are rare flowers on it or whatever. And you then hand in a kind of veto against me using my own lawn. People would, I guess, to some extent rethink the choice. So my first question would be, how realistic is it to put this into concrete legal frameworks? And would the general public then be as accepting as they are now, when they probably don't know this quite new movements in depth? My second question, if you may finish.
I'll start to write down that.
Yeah, I'm very short. I'm very quick. My second question is what you told us about contextualization. So today in the United Nations, and this concerns also UNESCO, which we are representing here with the UNESCO chair, are facing a polarization that is unseen, that is unprecedented on the global stage. So we have basically a dividing line between the democracies on one side and the non-democracies on the other side. And one characteristics of those two blocks is that one block, the democracies, provide human rights to their citizens and are very generous in equipping these human rights with concrete legal consequences. And the other block, the non-democracies led by China, Russia, Iran, and others who have been uniting over the Ukraine war, are characterized that they are not conceding human rights, at least not as they are meant by the United Nations. Now, what I see, and this is maybe a side note, is that, for example, China uses the concept of Tao, so the universal unity of being, be it from the side of nature, of the cosmos, of everything that lives, of humans involved in it. They're using the concept increasingly to say the human being is nothing special, so we don't have to concede human rights to our citizens, because it is anyway only a part of the Tao, only a part of the greater whole of nature. So my second question is, in essence, is there not the danger that this idea is also being misused for political purposes against human rights? These are my two questions, and I see there is quite a lot of interest to posit more questions. So I'm very happy if you're quick with my two initial questions, dear Alex.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Roland. And yeah, in depth, we will have to talk another time, but some quick thoughts. I agree that the poll about 6% against, 74% in favor is, yeah, okay, what do the people know about this? Because the idea, okay, rights to nature, okay, that's beautiful. And in fact, I hardly hear people initially be against this. And then you start to think a bit more, and you're like, okay, this could cause trouble. And I'm not hiding the fact that it's gonna be more complicated to not necessarily mow your lawn. I think this is a bit of a way to interpret it to an extreme, and that's not necessarily the point that at least I want to make with the rights of nature. It's not about if you're allowed or not allowed to mow your lawn. It's a bit more about the big picture, and it's a bit more about, again, this idea of justice in a sense. And the analogy would be that, no, I'll save that for later, but basically, is it possible to be implemented? In indigenous contexts, sometimes it seemed to be easier said than done, but there are quite a lot of scholars also in the German-speaking world that have talked about das ökologische Grundgesetz, for instance, and quite a few colleagues, and I think I've seen one of them also in the audience. We are currently writing also an introduction to how could you implement the rights of nature in the German context. So there are definitely ways to do that. The second question, which is basically a fundamental issue, if you have more rights holders, are the original rights holders to be endangered, which was also argument against the recognition of the rights for women. And then they said that men have less rights. And I think the difference here is, it would be the difference between a negative and a positive concept of freedom. So you could say that I, as a man, okay, if I cannot completely govern over women anymore, I have less freedom. But actually, I'd say I have an enhanced freedom because there is more interactions possible with stronger stakeholders, like bigger group of stronger stakeholders. That was quite abstract, but I think I will leave it at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Alex. Now we go to the questions. We have lots of time. Alex, I read the questions for you and start with the first one by Teminuga Trifonova. Thanks for a great presentation. You said that the rights of nature are conceived on analogy with human rights. Are there any aspects of the concept of rights that are differently conceived when we talk about the rights of nature? For instance, the idea of human rights is often understood alongside the idea of duties and obligations. Can nature be said to have duties and obligations towards humans?
Thanks, Temanuga. That is a frequent question. So if rights are the flip side of duties, and in a lot of cases they are, but, and you also right, is often understood and often is not always. So rights don't necessarily need to be the flip side of duties. We can just think of the rights of a newborn baby. There aren't really duties that a newborn baby has. And I'm not saying that nature is like an infant, but just to give you one example where it's not the case. On the aspect that in the Ecuadorian case, it was used as an analogy to human rights, but it doesn't need to be. There are also other sources. And me personally, I don't need to be using the terminology of rights because there is a whole literature on that and a lot of contentious if you should use the word rights, if you should use the word nature, if you should use the English language. I really don't care if we're using those, but what I do care about is if we talk about human rights for humans, we should talk about the rights of nature for nature. So it's about using the same language and crossing that divide between human and non-human nature.
Great.
Try to be short.
Yes, you do a great job since we have lots of more questions. Now from Christoph Kilcher, the following question. From a metaphysical point of view, I like the idea of distributing agency, subjectivity, and rights to non-human entities. From a practical point of view, however, I wonder whether all this effort to justify or ground rights of nature is necessary at all. In the end, these rights still have to be conceived, enforced, and complied with by humans. My question, why say a tree has an intrinsic right not to be cut down and not simply say humans are not allowed to cut down this tree? It would have the same outcome, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Question by Christoph Kilcher.
Thank you, Christoph. So this is, I alluded to it a little bit before, and this is this difference between a consequentialist, so a focus on the outcomes and the goals, and the justice idea. And here, another example that a thought experiment is that was also used for women's rights, for the rights of women. You could imagine a world where there is equality, it's difficult, but equality between all genders, between everything male and non-male. And perfect, no problem. The goal, the result is the same, just that only males have rights. And then you could say, okay, the goal is the same, but it doesn't seem right because maybe at one point someone goes crazy. So it's also a question of accountability, again, of justice. And more than that, if I work towards a goal of, to stick within the example of rights for all humans, and I only listen to males, then there will be a certain goal. But if I listen to all humans and what their interests are, then that goal will also change. So that question is the same then with nature. Now, okay, humans have to interpret the interests of that nature, have to speak on behalf, you could say, but more than anything, it is an encouragement, a motivation to listen better, to really, there is a term in environmental ethics that says, think like a mountain. It's not to think like a mountain, but it's to rethink the mountain. So that would be the idea behind that as well. Thank you for the question.
Next question comes from Francesca Cornella. Thanks for the interesting presentation. Again, since humans assign rights to nature, how can human bias be prevented? Or how can we make sure that these rights are not introduced, find their limits only insofar as it is acceptable for humans? Question by Francesca Cornella.
Or Nadia. Anyway, thank you. I think that's a bit related to the answer from before. So there is no way that we can really know what a mountain, what a river, and I'm using human terminologies here as well, that is also wrong. So what feels, sees, experiences. But at the same time, I am only, me personally, I'm ever only able to know what I, as Alex Putzer, knows. I don't know what goes through the mind of Roland, but I could nevertheless be imagining an approximation. And I think he might want to have food every once in a while. And so based on these approximations, I could see how an ecosystem could flourish, how an individual animal could flourish. So if we can observe, we have a lot of knowledge even within that human bias to find a way also towards the interests of nature. Yeah.
Next question comes from Ismaila Uedrogo, or EU for EU scholar. He asks, you gave a definition of the concept of rights of nature at the beginning. Is this a universally accepted definition? Don't you think cultural differences or legal systems in different countries can be a barrier to the adoption and implementation of an internationally accepted legal framework?
That's a very important question. Thanks, Ismaila. This is my working definition, so not at all universally accepted. It's not even accepted by myself, really, in all aspects. It's one point of departure, and the point of departure to go in this field and to look at what's been used. When I did this research for the global map, there was also the question, okay, how do we really look for those laws? And I don't know if you remember, but the African continent had like 3 initiatives, and I doubt that there aren't more. I was simply likely not using the right terminology to find equivalent concepts. So in a sense, the core, I would say, might remain the same, and you can use it in different languages. So the core is that it's not just the human that matters. And based on that, you can use all the different terminologies and apply it to cultural differences and different legal systems and try to find equivalents for that. And a lot of indigenous philosophies use such equivalents. Now there is the criticism of, okay, do you want to have a new Western concept applied to that as well? And there is definitely the danger, and you definitely have to be careful on not imposing them. But I still think there is this opportunity of a sort of a translation opportunity to understand that the other concepts as well. And so what was a barrier to the adoption? So an internationally accepted legal framework, the idea, there is the United Nations Harmony with Nature framework that kind of does that, but that can also be criticized. I would say there might be some core that is very abstract with very differentiating cultural then applications. Yeah.
Next question by Carolina Yashara, who is our global fellow. Thank you very much, Alex. I really enjoyed your presentation. If I understand it correctly, according to the rights of nature approach, environmental cases could be taken to court. So might there be a need for regulatory authorities which also have the financial resources to enforce this? Would the Umweltanwaltschaft you mentioned in your talk be something like that?
Thank you, Carolina. I did start with an image of a river to court, so that's also me that I reproduced this image of it's about suing, it's about litigation, it's about fighting. But more than that, I think it's this change of mindset where the court, as with all laws, is the ultimate idea. So before that, we'll find a lot of ways. If I'm fighting with someone, we're not in the US, I would say. So we are not going immediately to court. We're trying to find ways before that. Now, if it happens, the Umweltanwaltschaft would be, as far as I have understood the idea of it, would be such a place that also has the resources, because that's a problem, for instance, in Ecuador, that likely the people that would need to invoke the rights of nature most don't have the resources, they don't have the time, the capacities, whatever, to go to court, to sue a company that tries to extract the resources there. And so the allocation of financial resources is definitely also an issue, and that not only with environmental, or that not only with the rights of nature, but with all environmental protection efforts. The sad argument that would stay on the side of environmental activists is that there is not really a way out. So the ecological crisis, climate change, loss of biodiversity is there, and it's not going to go away if we just ignore it or if we don't finance or address it. So in that sense, the more urgent it gets, the more expensive it gets. And so that's, I guess, an inconvenient truth there. Thanks for the question.
Next question by our other UNESCO Chair Fellow, Sanya Bakun. She writes, motivating humans to fight for the rights of nature requires a multifaceted approach that appeals to both rational and emotional factors. Can you enumerate strategies that are not restrictive, legally binding, but still reaching the goal? Thanks a lot. Very good introduction into the rights of nature by Sanya.
Thank you, Sanya. The different strategies that I've found, okay, so I showed you the legal implementation, but there are also quite a few artistic explorations. A friend of mine from Austria gave rights to one of the glaciers in North Tyrol, Gebachferner, I think is the name. So there are declarations of non-governmental organizations, there are toolkits, there are guidances, there are talks like this, which I see myself also as one of the strategies to spread the word, to reach the goal in small step by steps. I would not immediately discount the idea of something legally binding. There is still a certain force, and it's still sort of, you know, fighting fire with fire. If there is an unjust law, then try to make the law just. If there is an unjust cultural tradition, then you fight it with other cultural traditions. And since this idea of seeing nature only as a resource to be extracted, to be used for human benefit, and it's in the West so much entrenched in so many aspects, be it law, be it the cultures, be it movies, be it everything, then I guess we have to identify them in all those different fields and on those different levels and address them accordingly in all those different fields and levels. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question by Miriam Gruber. Thanks for the interesting presentation. To better understand the right of nature as a research field topic, I would like to ask, what are your research objectives aimed within this field, and what are research questions you are addressing concretely, maybe in your PhD? Let me maybe add from my side, Alex, it would be great to know what exactly the United Nations program on harmony with nature does, what they are really into at the moment, what their political stand is. So this would maybe give a little bit more substance to how the reality is then created by the international organizations. But let's come back to Miriam Gruber. Thank you, Miriam, for the question.
Thank you, Miriam. That's a question I wanted to put in there as well. So for self-promotion. No, my PhD is, the research question is, how can you apply such an idea like the rights of nature, such a non-anthropocentric idea, to a very human altered, to an anthropogenic world? And so specifically, how do you apply the rights of nature in cities? Because cities are the most human altered environment. So in one sense, the question that I look at in my PhD, what is the nature in the rights of nature? And there are just so many different concepts of nature. That's actually the chapter I'm working on in my, I don't know if you, no, you cannot see it. Okay, censored by Zoom. But there are so many different ideas. If I were to ask you, what is the definition? How would you define nature? You might say, I don't know, everything that's non-human. Okay, fair enough. That's how law and a lot of Western morals see it. But if you ask a biologist, what is nature? Well, of course, the human is part of nature. We are also an animal. And then you ask a physicist and they say, well, everything is made up of atoms. And just those three different fields already give vastly different policy recommendations. Because if you say everything is nature, physics is nature, climate change is nature, death is natural, a flooding is natural. Okay, then you cannot do anything anymore. If you say the human is part, okay, then we can interact with our environment. We can like restore ecosystems. If you say everything that every wilderness that human touches loses value, okay, then we cannot interact. And so there are really different results based on the different ideas of nature that you have. So I look at that on one aspect in my PhD, and that's specifically in cities, because cities have, you know, parks, there's urban wilderness, the pigeons, the birds that you see, the rats that you see, is that like a wild animal? Is that a domesticated? Is it in between? What about the dogs, the cats? What about the river through a town? And how would an urban tree have rights? How would that even work if the tree depends on a human infrastructure to water them? And so those are the questions that that I look at specifically. And in order to get there and to not underestimate also the huge implications that the rights of nature have on social justice. So let's not use the rights of nature to discriminate against humans, to not respect human rights. there is a dilemma going on. So how do we do that? There are the planetary boundaries, so that's a concept that shows the limits that we can use nature as a resource, and we are exceeding them. So there's this material limitation on one point, but there's also a very social, a political limitation in the sense that the standard of living of a lot of people on the planet, that's a huge achievement. It was used by destroying nature, but it's still very valuable as well. So how does this work? And there are estimates that say right now it doesn't work. So how do we handle that? And how do we handle that in cities? So that's the PhD in as short as possible as I could mention it. Now, how does the United Nations Harmony with Nature program do it? Differently. They don't, so the idea of the program, it exists in 2009. They have yearly so-called interactive dialogues to be held online, hybrid, and in New York. It's always on on Earth Day, which is the April 22nd every year. And they sort of form a hub. So it's kind of a networking event. So that's also where I met a few people that I didn't know were working in the field. So it's also sort of this mutual enforcement. And I would argue that 5 years ago, they were there, but now they are more outgoing. They have a huge influence from indigenous peoples, for the good and for the better and for the worse. And they use, harmony with nature is inspired a little bit by this idea of the balance of nature, and that humans, that's a quote by Antonio Guterres, he said like several times that humans are at war with nature. But if you want to say that, that means that that we are not part of nature. Like we cannot be at war with ourselves. Mm-hmm. Sure, but that's not how he meant it. And the United Nations Harmony with Nature program is also going a bit down that lane. So I feel like they could open themselves up to different ideas of nature. And the balance of nature, it's very nice. There is an equilibrium in nature and we're destroying it, but that is, scientifically speaking, nonsense. It doesn't exist really. And so it is a bit idealistic, but that's what the United Nations are a bit about, to have like this idea of an ideal goal somewhere and something that is abstract enough, so enough people, the global human population can gather around. But I would say the most important part that they are doing right now is to connect the different activists and academics, because it is still very fringe. It is still very new. We are not there yet, even though it's urgent.
Yeah, I think your characterization of the United Nations is quite accurate, Alex. And this is also valid, obviously, for UNESCO. Next question, we cannot go into it because we have lots of more questions from Francesca Cornella. This is now actually the question by Francesca. The other one was by Nadia. Alex, thank you for your stimulating intervention. My first question concerns the concept of promoting nature with a non-anthropocentric understanding of it. How would you relate this concept with that of convivial conservation, which advocates the abolition of the dichotomy between humans and natures, promoting nature in connection with humans instead of only protecting it? The second question concerns the connection that the rights of human nature have with the issue of biodiversity enhancement. Thank you very much. Two questions actually by Francesca Cornella.
Should I try to go quicker and then maybe there are more down below, or
we have more questions down below. I think we can extend the discussion a bit because it's so interesting and there's such a lot of,
I don't want to keep anyone.
Of inquiry pending. So just go on.
So convivial conservation, there's another one that I can think of that also does a similar thing. So the rights of nature oftentimes do advocate for the abolition of this dichotomy between human and non-human nature. That's why I always, like in my text, I use the words human and non-human nature to say, you know, nature is also humans. But then you also have to ask your question, okay, if you really abolish the entire dichotomy, then this question of social justice comes into play, because then the argument would be, okay, if humanity is a species like any other species, and in certain contexts, they are species that harms an ecosystem, in that moment, you would need to get the species out of that ecosystem. And that you could maybe imagine all the human rights violations that would encounter. So in that sense, I don't want to, and I think I'm in the minority, but like that dichotomy has also its justification to the degree to not violate certain fundamental human rights, which is more of a political justification than an ethical one. But just like that. So because convivial conversation is important, but it also, as far as I am, correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't exclude, or it's still humans and non-humans. So there is still those two elements that you cannot really get rid of one. So the human still has its Daseinsberechtigung, its justification of existence. The second question concerns the connection with the issue of biodiversity enhancement. Enhancement in the sense that there is human interventions to enhance biodiversity, which would create this idea of a novel ecosystem. I haven't found it, but it is part of my dissertation, in that sense that when you do a restoration, when you do in cities like Vienna, you have those wild meadows in the city that you don't mow anymore. So Roland cannot mow there anymore. And, you know, it's not seen as, oh, it's forbidden to mow there. No, it's seen, oh no, that is actually better for all of us. And so it's nobody has to go to court, nothing is happening. You don't feel unjust, you actually feel you have an enhanced lifestyle. And so in that sense, I think it's very compatible. Thanks for the question.
Great, so we are closing into the end. Two more questions. The next one is from Elisa Beerus, a senior researcher at the Center for Advanced Studies. Thank you for your presentation, Alex. Two quick questions. How compatible are the rights of nature with the cosmopolitan model of global governance? Would they be a way to overcome one of the frontiers of justice Martin Nussbaum wrote about? Question by Elisa Beerus.
That's a very Elisa question. Thank you for the question. How compatible? I have to be honest, I haven't thought about that compatibility yet. But from the top of my head, it's this question of, you know, how universal can you make this concept while still being concrete enough to have a real effect on the ground? I would say my questions are too general in that moment, really, my answers. So do you want to specify which frontier really of justice? Maybe if you want to unmute yourself. No? Okay, then I think I'm unable to answer the question.
Elisa says,
species frontier. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, now I know. To the degree, and then again, to the degree that there is the so-called marginal case argument that says that non-human apes, for instance, a fully grown chimpanzee or a gorilla has, in all aspects that I showed you in the animal welfare comparison chart, in all aspects that matter, you know, consciousness, mind, tool use, intelligence, language, they are more advanced than a 3-year-old human baby or certain people with certain cognitive disabilities. And that's an argument that says, okay, there is a speciesism if we still prefer the life of the 2-year-old. Okay, but that is still this frontier of social justice. So I'm not giving it now an answer to, you know, just keep speciesism, but it's more than the question of if it's not the extreme. There is an example that 100,000 elephant lives matter less than 1 human life. That's the extreme, but that's not what this is about. This is also about way more concrete examples. There was one that was a dilemma in a zoo in Cincinnati. 3-year-old boy fell into the enclosure of a gorilla, and the gorilla was, people weren't sure, or the zoo wasn't sure if the gorilla is going to hurt the boy, and so they had to shoot the gorilla. And that was this whole debate. Okay, should we have shot the gorilla? Should we have saved the boy? So there are also more concrete examples where this needs to play out. I'm unable to give like an answer for every single case. Depends on the context, as everyone would, as every academic always uses when there are no answers. So thanks for the question.
Great. So, and to conclude, we have a question from my sister, actually, Birgit Benedicta, who is an animal rights activist too, a teacher. She writes, after more than 30 years following Klaus Bostelmann's call for juridical rights of nature and his book In the Name of Nature, there are now rights for rivers and oceans. Are there already precedents for legally implemented specific rights for animals as species or individuals? Question by Birgit Benedicta.
Thank you, Birgit. So Bostelmann is kind of the Pope of environmental law, also in New Zealand based. There are, I don't want to say more, arguably more. So the animal, so when I talked about the different rights, I said human rights, animal rights, rights of nature. And this distinction is also existent in the literature because there is this fight if non-human animals should be seen as individuals or as part of a species or as part of an ecosystem, because that also creates different policy implications. If we use, and I saw Elisa used a lot of dilemmas, there are a lot of dilemmas in South Tyrol. Am I going to step into the bear debate? But if we talk about the bears, sustainable size, a sustainable bear population needs, if I recall correctly, like 50 to 60 individuals. And now there are more than that. And there are also always a few that are problematic. So if you look at bears as an individual, you would say, okay, every single bear has the right to life, it can suffer, it is conscious, it has a mind, we cannot kill any bear. If you look at it as a more ecosystemic way, and most rights of nature activists and academics look at it in a systemic way, they could say, okay, look, what matters is that the ecosystem functions. Now, the ecosystem could be the species of bears, it could be the ecosystem of non-human nature in the region, but it could also be the ecosystem of human and non-humans in the region. And so if you look at it from this systemic way, and you could say, look, there are an X amount of problem bears by chance, and we look at it in a systemic way, and we want to have the conviviality, we want to have the co-living between humans and bears as the goal, and then you could justify also the shooting of that bear. If you look at it from the systemic one, again, that's, and I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for either one, I'm just saying that it depends on how you see nature, because that's the problem also with just using human rights as an analog for rights of nature. Human rights are decisively individualistic, but with nature, you can only get that far by looking at it individually. You know, you can do it with animals, you can do it kind of with trees. It already gets difficult. How do you do it with mushrooms? How do you do it with, you know, entangled environments? Cannot really talk about a part of an ocean. There is so much interconnection in interrelation that this idea of the individual already gets lost. So that's one thing. And then the very last thing, and I want to steal more of your time, is the question of, and it might have slipped my mind, that animal rights is older, is an older movement and more established. And so if the question is the rights of nature, how successful are they? And then somebody once said that, you know, animal rights, that also didn't do much, but I would argue that it did quite a lot of things. And there are a lot of databases of animal welfare improvements. And in fact, the welfare of animals has improved massively in the past 100 years. And the rights of nature basically say, okay, the next logical step is to go beyond animals, to also consider nature that is even farther from what we consider as a part of nature that is worthy, that has value, that is worth having rights. And so as a final thought, I would want you to invite, with the struggle that I've had now for years, to, you know, how can you really understand what a tree wants really, or a rock or something? And I'm not saying that I have answers, not at all, but just trying to go in that direction can not only improve the existence of that specific rock, but also in hindsight then the existence of the animals and the trees and the rivers that depend on that rock because of this huge interrelation. So thanks a lot for that question.
And thanks a lot to you, Alex, for this beautiful vision, with which I would conclude. It's a beautiful vision of a world where we are more sentient, we are more connected to, and I think this perfectly is in accordance with the vision and the basic ethics of the United Nations and UNESCO. Now, I want to thank you all for joining us to this lecture, also in the name of Harald Bechlaner, our head of center at the Center for Advanced Studies. And I would like to invite you to join us again 1 week from now. We will have a very, very inspiring lecture by our global fellow Temenuga Trifonova from the University College London, who will talk about the social, economic, and psychological effects of neoliberalism as mirrored in contemporary European cinema. So stay with us. Let's meet again next Wednesday at the same time, same place. Thank you so much, dear Alex, for an excellent and very, very inspiring lecture. It is really, really something that we should go deeper into and stay with us a topic. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Alex, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.